being refreshed after this wonderful lunch, we can resume again, this time with ancient ideology's favorite, the hoplite. And my Copenhagen colleague, Adam Schwartz, has been investigating the topic for quite many years now, although he has also been proficient in other matters as well, not least translating the work of Thucydides from Greek to Danish. A huge, huge project and demanding one, since making updates on it. Well, anyway, Adam, the word is yours, please.
Thank you. Thank you to David Pritchard and Ian Worthington for arranging this wonderful conference and for thinking of me in that connection. Claude Mossé argued forcefully and cogently that Athens went into a sharp decline in the 4th century. Her explanatory model was multifaceted, but the Athenian military played a pivotal role. As the rift, she claimed, between rich and poor widened following the losses of the Peloponnesian War, including Athens' empire and hegemony, political power became concentrated on a few unscrupulous generals. Relying on mercenary forces who were loyal primarily to the generals themselves and who had to be paid with plunder, they were largely beyond the control of the Athenian state. This situation was exacerbated by an apathetic citizen body, sapped of the determination to fight the necessary wars, and increasingly preferring to leave the fighting to these same mercenary forces. And the rot spread to all military branches, except with the possible exception of the Navy. And yet, as Yvon Galland famously pointed out, from the Persian Wars down to the Battle of Chaeronea, Athens was at war 2 out of any 3 given years, and at no point experienced 10 continuous years of peace. So clearly, the Athenians of the 4th century, who waged war even more frequently than they did in the 5th, were not disaffected with war as such. It may be true that Athens' hoplite arm had not been the mainstay of her military might since at least the mid-5th century, when the primary means of power projection had shifted decisively to the navy, but until the end of the 5th century, it had nevertheless given a very respectable account of itself. In this paper, I would like to attempt to assess the Athenian hoplite effort in the 4th century to determine whether we may reasonably identify a decline in this area as part of the general postulated trend. And just to begin with some of the underlying institutions of the 4th century, since the early 5th century, Athenian hoplites had been drafted by Katalogos. This was a roster drawn up on a campaign-by-campaign basis from among all those of hoplite status. The demarchoi, who were responsible for maintaining their respective demes lexiarchikon grammateion, provided the strategoi with these, and on that basis they then made their selection. This was a procedure that enabled an extremely granular selection of exactly those hoplites wanted for the mission at hand, but it was a slow and onerous process, and precisely because based on the principle of handpicking, open to accusations of abuse. But at some point in the 4th century, this was reformed. By the late 330s, the Aristotelian constitution of the Athenians describes the then current method, and I quote, "There are 10 eponymous heroes of the tribes, but 42 of the year classes, helikiai. Ephebes being registered used to be written up on whitened boards. Now they are recorded on a bronze stele, and the stele is erected in front of the bouleuterion by the tribal eponymous heroes. They also use the eponymous heroes in connection with military campaigns. Whenever they send men of a certain age, on campaign, they post a notice that indicates by archons and eponymous heroes the range of year classes that are to serve." Unquote. Now, the fact that Ephebes, quote, used to be written up on whitened boards, unquote, shows that that system must have been in use for some time, but nothing definite. There are indications, however, in both Demosthenes and Aeschines that year-class drafting was in use around the mid-4th century. One Aeschines passage may push the terminus back to 366 and seems in any event also to reveal a somewhat regulated use of ephebes in certain military roles. Indeed, something like ephebic service appears to have been in existence for a long time by this point, though just how systematized is not quite certain. What is certain, however, is that the law of Epicrates, enacted in 336-5, sanctioned the ephebeia, whether reforming or launching it, in a version that comprised a state-sponsored 2-year training regimen. The twin systems of ephebeia and of calling up by year classes were probably linked, the operative criterion in both being age. Indeed, the adoption of year classes as the basis for drafting may have issued organically from an increasing reliance on the ephebeia, with initiates undergoing formalized training and guarding borders for a service period of 2 years. But drafting by year classes was a break with tradition and hardly a decision lightly taken. First, it necessitated the enormous task of establishing a central permanent register of all eligible hoplites and of keeping this register up to date all the time. And second, it constituted a considerably more equitable way of apportioning the burden of military service. The earlier hoplite catalogus was drawn up seemingly at the discretion of the strategoi, and their criteria were not subject to scrutiny in any way. Employing age as a sole criterion, however, ensured that entire year classes were called up, inevitably a cross-section of society, and not just of some hoplite class. Lycurgus, in 330, is explicit that all citizens swear the ephebic oath when first being inscribed in their lexiarchicon grammateon, just as the constitution of the Athenians gives no indication of any class-based exclusion. Accordingly, any census class basis for drafting must have been discontinued at the latest when the year class system was introduced, and this in itself constitutes a far-reaching democratization of the armed forces. This may, of course, have diluted the potential prestige in being selected, if you will, but it distributed the burden much more fairly, as everyone within a year class, or several year classes, would be called up for service simultaneously. Such drastic changes, however, were unlikely to be introduced on these grounds alone, unless they could also provide tangible military advantages. Most obvious in this category is perhaps the reduced mobilization time. Rather than first having to obtain all the lexiarchica grammateia and compile a roster, the strategoi could simply post the relevant year classes directly. And this may have answered a keenly perceived concern after the numerous enemy incursions into Attica during the Peloponnesian War, a threat that, by the way, kept looming in subsequent wars during the 4th century, and always a situation that necessitated a swift response. The real military advantage, however, lay after 336-35 in the interface between the year class call-up and the institutionalized military training of young recruits. Regarded as at best a private matter in the ideological atmosphere of amateurism prevalent in the 5th century, training now became a linchpin in an effective military. Once operational, the program would guarantee a steady, long-term supply of hoplites trained by professionals to a consistent and dependable quality and inculcated with discipline and esprit de corps to fight together as a unit. It would also guarantee, in any particular emergency, plentiful reserves of year classes to be called up and deployed on short notice. Now, improving one's military efficiency hardly needs any reason beyond itself, but one may nevertheless be identified in the formidable opponents that Athenian hoplites faced on the battlefields of the 4th century, Spartans, Thebans, and increasingly professionals who fought wars for a living did little else, such as mercenaries and ultimately Macedonians. Basic training for Ephebes lasted 1 year while garrisoned in Piraeus and fell into 2 categories: basic physical exercise taught by 2 paidotrybai, and weapons training taught by an unspecified number of didaskaloi, officers elected by the assembly and probably technical specialists. After this first year, a public military review was held in which the Ephebes, on demonstrating their newly acquired skills, as the constitution of Athens has it, taperitas taxes, were each formally presented by the state with a set of spear and shield, aspida kaidori. These are unambiguously hoplite maneuvers and hoplite weapons, underlining the fact that the Ephebes, familiarization with other weapons notwithstanding, were primarily intended to join the hoplite arm on passing out. The Ephebes then spent the second year of their service guarding Atticus borders, both on patrols, ripoloi, and on garrison duty in the border fortresses, phylacteria, where they could get a chance to test their acquired skills and possibly even experience combat. And whatever the costs before, if any, this reformed Ephebeia of 335 constituted a significant financial sacrifice on the part of the Athenian democracy. Weapons for the Ephebes, pay for the various officers and trainers, and provisions and accommodation for the Ephebes themselves during the 2-year service had to be financed at a cost approximating 42 to 43 talents annually, not taking into account the necessary infrastructure for quartering, training, and so forth. Clearly, the institution of the Ephebeia was seen as important for the Athenian military effort. Now, with these changes as a backdrop, let us next turn to those actions of the 4th century in which Athenian hoplites were involved as documented in the sources. And at this point, I should perhaps stress that I've only taken into account those sources that specifically mention hoplite actions and not those where it might be implied. And this applies to a range of naval operations where epibatai may have employed or where the rowers may have been intended to serve as hoplites. This is only where hoplites are mentioned. Right. So after a period of political and military alignment with Sparta following the Peloponnesian War, Athens found herself embroiled in the Corinthian War. And at Haliotos in 395, a Theban army succeeded in repulsing a Spartan attack. And the arrival of an Athenian relief force under Thrasybulos 2 days later was sufficient to discourage Pausanias, in command of another Spartan army, from attempting a renewed attack. Xenophon's statement that the Athenians, quote, deployed in the field with the Thebans, unquote, rather points to hoplites. This minor success was followed by 2 defeats in quick succession at the twin pitched battles of Nemea and Coronea, both in 394. At Nemea, the joint coalition army fielded 24,000 hoplites and 1,550 cavalry, the Athenian citizen hoplite contingent accounting for 6,000 of these hoplites. Posted on the left wing, they faced the Spartans, who occupied their own right wing as a matter of course. During its advance, the allied phalanx veered to the right to such an extent that of the Athenians, numerically otherwise roughly equal to the Spartans, only 6 phylae engaged the Spartans, the remaining 4 extending to the Tigeans next to them. And as a consequence, the overlapping Spartan right enveloped the Athenians, and by extension the entire allied formation, and killed many of them. Conclusions about the Athenian effort are scarcely possible here, however. They cannot reasonably be blamed, certainly, for being outflanked. There was little they could do to prevent the flanking maneuver, since remaining in place would have opened a gap in the formation instead, with similar results. And once the formation was broken, defeat was a virtual certainty. At Coronea, the very same year, an Athenian contingent of citizen hoplites and cavalry fought with the coalition and again were defeated along with them. No sources describe the Athenians, possibly because the horrific slaughter occurring between Spartans and Thebans overshadowed everything else for the informants. As it is, we have no information on the Athenian numbers, the position in the formation, the casualties, or indeed their effort during the fighting. There would be no more large-scale pitched battles fought between coalition armies in this war. The next phase, from approximately 391 to 88, consisted largely in smaller engagements on Corinthian territory and primarily involving smaller non-citizen forces. In 392, however, troops under Iphicrates were defeated with Athens' other allies by Spartans and Corinthian exiles in a hoplite battle fought between the arms of the long walls extending from Corinth to Lycaon. However, Iphicrates' troops next invaded Phaeacian territory and defeated the defenders who came out to meet them, then marched on Sicyon and repeated the feat there. The Athenians also, on one occasion, we are informed, took the field pandemei, a word normally denoting a full-scale mobilization of all hoplites fit for military service, and they did so to help the Corinthians rebuild their demolished long walls. The undisputed greatest triumph of Iphicrates' mercenary corps followed 2 years later in 390, the annihilation near Lycaon of an entire Spartan mora, some 600 hoplites or a sixth of the army. Iphicrates ably exploited his Peltasts' superior maneuverability against the heavier Spartan hoplites and indisputably won the day. But Athenian citizen hoplites nevertheless played an important part. The attack was executed in cooperation with Callias, Iphicrates' strategos colleague, who was in command of the hoplite contingent. Deployed outside the walls of Corinth at the outset, it sealed the route by advancing the remnants of the Spartan mora and their approaching relief troops. In 389, Chrysibulos, while on another mission with 40 ships, wished to put down a burgeoning rebellion among the poleis of Lesbos. He accordingly went ashore with 400 hoplites, which should probably be understood as the aggregate of his ship's complements of Epipatae, supplemented with various locals. He then marched on Methymna and defeated the forces of the Spartan Harmost Thermachos. The following year, Chabrias was dispatched to Cyprus to aid King Evagrius I against Persia, with 10 ships and 800 Peltasts under his command and, quote, adding more ships and hoplites from Athens, unquote. On the way there, he landed on Aegina at night time with the Peltasts and set up an ambush. The next morning, the hoplite force under Demynetos went ashore in broad daylight, and when Gorgopas, the Spartan Harmost in command on Aegina, marched out to intercept them with a force hastily thrown together, the ambush was sprung, catching him in the middle. Gorgopas was defeated and killed along with approximately 150 Aeginetan troops and 50 others, including all 8 Spartiates. The Corinthian War had come to an unsatisfactory conclusion for Athens, as the ultimate goal of re-establishing her empire had not been reached. This was reflected in the foreign policy of the following period, which saw Athens, with shifting allegiances, further embroiled in internal Greek wars. When Theban exiles overthrew their pro-Spartan puppet government in 379-78, there was widespread Athenian support, though just how widespread is uncertain. The crucial chapter in Xenophon has a lacuna just after relating the Theban request for help from 2 Athenian strategoi stationed on their border. In Diodorus, by contrast, Athenian support is unambiguous. In response to a Theban embassy, Demophon and another strategos were dispatched with 5,000 Athenian citizen hoplites and 500 cavalry to help the Thebans liberate Spartan-occupied Cadmeia, and with a full-scale mobilization, pandemei, to follow. The infamous botched raid on Attica and Piraeus soon after by the Spartan commander Sphodrius outraged the Athenians, and according to Diodorus, they, quote, voted to levy 20,000 hoplites and 500 cavalry and to man 200 ships, unquote. Numbers of both hoplites and ships which seem a bit exaggerated, perhaps. Polybius mentions 10,000 soldiers and 100 triremes, a rather more plausible exact half of Diodorus' numbers. In 377, the Athenians aided the Thebans against the first Spartan invasion of Boeotia with 5,000 infantry, pitsoi, and 200 cavalry under Chabrias, likely enough citizen soldiers. Demosthenes and Polyaenos explicitly mention Athenian hoplites, whereas Diodorus only says that Chabrias commanded mercenary troops in this context also. And as a curiosity, in 373-72, Iphicrates was sent to Corcyra with a fleet of 70 ships, later taking his Peltasts and Hoplites across to Acarnania to find employ with any polis friendly to Athens. After the Battle of Leuctra in 371, the increasing threat from Thebes finally saw Athens concluding an alliance with Sparta in 369, and the very same year the assembly voted to help defend Laconia against Theban invasion. The Athenians mobilized Pandeme, appointing Iphicrates Strategos, quote, and refused to listen to those who spoke against it, unquote. Xenophon, while vehemently critical of Iphicrates' generalship on this occasion, nevertheless emphasizes the motivation of the Athenians who followed him, quote, believing that he would lead them to some fine achievement, unquote, and despite their recent misgivings about his leadership, they, quote, followed him enthusiastically and enthusiastically attacked any fortified place he led them against, unquote. Diodorus claimed that the contingent consisted of 12,000 young men alone, Neoi, seems very high, at least twice that of most contemporary hoplite forces dispatched by Athens, 6,000 in 394 and 362, 5,000 twice in 378, and again in 352. And, as we have seen, his claim of 20,000 hoplites, 500 cavalry, and crews of 200 ships, levied after Sfotria's raid, seems even more questionable. The fall of the border town Oropos to Thebes in 366 was a severe blow to Athens, and worse, none of her allies were willing to help her reconquer it. And Athens' own all-out attempt, again Pandeme, to do so fell flat on its face. In 362, Athens fulfilled her alliance obligations by sending 6,000 citizen hoplites and an unknown number of cavalry, under Hegesileos to fight at Mantinea. Stationed on the left wing, the contingent was pinned down by enemy cavalry and unable to join the fray, but nevertheless remained intact in the general defeat around them, and in fact inflicted losses on enemy Hamippoi and Peltasts returning from Epaminondas' opening maneuvers. In 359-58, Athens dispatched Mantius with 3,000 hoplites and a, quote, considerable squadron, unquote, to aid Argaios, a pretender to the Macedonian throne, against Philip II. It is uncertain whether these hoplites were mercenaries, and the effort came to naught anyway. But here, for once, is a possible inkling of non-Athenian mercenary hoplites. In 357, near the outbreak of the social war, Athens responded to an entreaty for support against Thebes from some of the poleis on Euboea, and landed an army there within days. The force, according to Aeschines, consisted of Athenian citizens, and I quote, within 5 days you came to their aid with a force consisting of ships and infantry, and before 30 days had passed, you forced the Thebans to come to terms and sent them packing, unquote. This campaign apparently involved no pitched battle, but rather a series of skirmishes. Athens came out of the social war weakened by the loss of her most important allies and of the Second Athenian League in all but name, but still in possession of a considerable navy, at least on paper, as we've heard earlier today. Nevertheless, entering into a state of war with Macedon as a consequence of siding with Phocas in the Sacred War in 356 was unfortunate, to say the least. Nevertheless, in 352, Athens managed to field a strong hoplite contingent yet again, 5,000 hoplites and 400 cavalry under Nausicles to help the Phocians check Philip's southward progress at Thermopylae. And Philip, in fact, turned back rather than risk attacking this strong position. Athens next sent 2,000 mercenary Peltasts and 38 triremes under Charis to relieve Olynthos under attack by Philip in late 349. Already in January 348, Philip, to divert and bind Athenian troops, supported an uprising in Euboea against Plutarchus, tyrant of Eretria and an ally of Athens, and also brought in mercenaries from Macedon. To deal with this threat, the Athenians dispatched Phocion with a small force of picked citizen troops, Pilectoi, and at Tamynae, his troops and those of Plutarchus gave battle and routed the Euboeans and Macedonians. Aeschines fought this battle himself as a hoplite, and Plutarch also speaks of it as a hoplite victory. Their citizen soldier status, moreover, seems to be corroborated by Phocian's problems with discipline. And at the same time, while this was going on, Charidemus was sent with reinforcement to Olynthus, another 4,000 mercenaries, Peltasts, and 18 triremes. Nevertheless, over the summer, Philip led siege to the city, and the hard-pressed Olynthians made a final appeal to Athens, quote, not to stand by and watch them be utterly vanquished, but to send them, in addition to the troops and materiel already there, a relief force not of mercenaries, but of the Athenians themselves, unquote. The assembly was finally persuaded to send a third force consisting of 2,000 citizen hoplites, 300 cavalry, and 17 additional triremes, and with Charis as supreme commander. But before it could arrive, Olynthus had fallen by treachery, alas. Apart from some rather obscure operations under Charis in Thrace in 347-46, with troops of uncertain type, we hear of nothing until Philip turned the pass at Thermopylae in 346. Athens, war-weary and exhausted at this point, realized the necessity of getting out of the sacred war, by now a losing proposition, and accepted Philip's peace offering. Even after this, however, we do get a glimpse of an expedition to secure Drymos and Panactos on the Boeotian border. Philip largely left Athens to her own devices, and hostilities only flared up again in 343, when a corps of citizen soldiers was rapidly dispatched to Megara, which was threatened by Philip, and arrived in time to help the Megarians secure and fortify their city and port. Euboea saw Athenian operations yet again in 341, this time against local tyrants installed by Philip. Cephisophon, jointly with the Chalcidians of Euboea and the Megarians, attacked Oreos, killing her tyrant Philistides, while Phocion took Eretria by siege, ousted her tyrant Cleitarchus, and installed democracy. Next, in 338, Philip managed to turn the Allied defense line at Thermopylae simply by crossing the mountains instead of the pass. And after some preliminary winter skirmishes, his forces finally bore down the coalition army at Chaeronea in August 338. The guarding force at Thermopylae, some 10,000 strong, had been composed primarily of mercenaries, and so Philip now faced the Theban and Athenian citizen hoplites. The Athenian contingent, a full-scale mobilization, and May, of all year classes through the age of 50, sent out under Charis, Lysicles, and Stratocles, numbered approximately 10,000 hoplites and 600 cavalry. Nevertheless, we hear, quote, all the young men had reported for battle enthusiastically, unquote. The Thebans and Boeotians were posted on the right wing, the allies in the middle, and the Athenians under Stratocles occupied the left wing. Diodorus' account of the battle is reliably formulaic and provides few details. Polyaenus, whatever his source, is more interesting. In one stratagem, he has realized that the Athenians opposite him were, quote, hot-headed and untrained, unquote, and so exhausted them by drawing out the engagement. In another, Philip lures the inexperienced Athenians to take up pursuit by feigning a slow retreat, causing gaps in their ranks, and then retreats. Both stratagems obviously portrayed the Athenian hoplites as outclassed by their adversaries. And while it is perhaps unsurprising that they could not physically match Macedonian veterans for whom fighting, as I said, was a way of life, the lack of combat discipline is a rather graver charge. But then that is a thing difficult to acquire perhaps outside of combat, and it had been quite a long time since Athens had fought a pitched hoplite battle. So at least the younger year classes will have lacked actual battle experience. Casualties were heavy. 1,000 Athenian hoplites were killed and another 2,000 taken captive, 3,000 citizens in all, and nearly a third of all available hoplites up to the age of 50. It is a measure, I think, of Athenian desperation afterwards that among the countermeasure considered was a suggestion by Hipparides to bestow not only amnesty on all Atimoi, but also full citizen rights on metics, xenoi, and even state slaves, provided only they were willing to fight. The years after QUATRIÈME constitute the longest 4th century period without Athenian involvement in any major war, but the death of Alexander the Great in 323 seemed to offer a chance at breaking free of Macedonian hegemony. Leosthenes, who had been Strategos before in 329-28, had defied Alexander's decree to his commanders and satraps to disband mercenaries in their command, and had instead amassed and assembled 8,000 of them at Tyneron, while also conducting secret negotiations with the Athenian council. The upshot was the 2,000 mercenaries, 500 cavalry, and a mobilization of citizen hoplites through the age of 40 from 7 phylae, amounting to 5,000 men, were sent out to join Leosthenes' 8,000 mercenaries, augmented by 7,000 troops from the Aetolian League. The Athenian contingent on its way there was checked at Plataea by Boeotian and Euboean loyalist forces, who were defeated, however. A battle next ensued with Antipatros, who had marched south with 13,000 infantry and 600 cavalry. His numerically inferior forces were defeated in open battle and sought refuge behind the walls of Lamia, where Leosthenes laid siege to them. Meanwhile, a force of Macedonians and mercenaries under Mykion landed at Rhamnus in Attica, where Phocion, charged with the defense of Attica, led out the home defense forces, namely the 3 remaining phylae of hoplites, engaged the enemy and, quote, caused a total rout, killing Mykion himself and many others, unquote. In the following spring of 322, Leonatos marched on Thessaly with 20,000 infantry and 2,500 cavalry. But despite Leosthenes' successor Antiphilos' forces, now 22,000 infantry and 3,500 cavalry, defeating them and killing Leonatos in a pitched battle to prevent the Macedonians from joining forces, they nevertheless achieved just that the next day. Crateros finally arrived with 10,000 infantry, 1,000 Persian bowmen and slingers, and 1,500 cavalry, and linked up with Antipatros at Kranon, bringing the total to 40,000 heavy armed infantry, entois paresin hoplois, 3,000 bowmen and slingers, and 5,000 cavalry against the Greek 25,000 infantry and 3,500 cavalry. This turned the scales definitively. In the following Battle of Kranon, a cavalry action was undecided, but the numerically superior Macedonians drove the Greek infantry off the battlefield, losing 150 of their own and killing 500 allied Greeks, of which 200 Athenians in the process. This defeat spelled the end of the war for the Greek coalition, which crumbled little by little as Antipatros offered terms to each in turn, isolating Athens and Aetolia until they too were forced to accept the terms offered. So what do we make of all this? Let me try to sum up. Admittance of all as citizens to the hoplite arm, an institutionalized ephebeia for all 18 to 20-year-old citizens, and drafting by year classes. These initiatives were entirely in line with the fundamental egalitarian ideals and tenets of the reformed 4th century Athenian democracy. In fact, I think it can be argued that they constituted an increased commitment to these ideals, giving more citizens access and opportunity to fight as hoplites, and, at least in part, subsidizing their arms as well as sustenance and accommodation during training, was at once more equitable and more egalitarian, and as such, a natural extension of the core democratic ideology. If, as seems likely, both ephebic service in some shape and drafting by year classes existed before the middle of the century, they had been voted into existence already at that point by an assembly which thereby not only acted in accordance with their faith in democracy, but also committed fully to the consequences it entailed. Any and all Athenian citizens would be liable to continuous military service and the very likely prospect of one day having to face an enemy phalanx on the field of battle. Such a level of commitment is, if anything, I think, indicative of considerable enthusiasm for democratic Athens, and moreover, indicative of an apparently undiminished capacity for fighting her wars, whether for survival, independence, conquest, hegemony, sustained warfare simply remained an integral part of Athenian policy. None of this, to me at least, smacks of abject defeatism, an exhausted democracy, or a sapped will to fight. Quite the contrary, in fact. And this seal is, moreover, I suggest, directly observable in the performance of the Athenian hoplite arm throughout the 4th century. Attendance remained strong and stable throughout, with expeditionary corps regularly numbering 5,000 or 6,000 hoplites, or between 16 and 20% of the citizen body numbering around 30,000, tentatively. Unlike the heyday of the previous century, there are perhaps no spectacular victories, such as Marathon, and this, combined with some notable shared defeats in major coalition battles fought against the best infantries of the day, such as at the battle at Coronea, Nemea, Mantinea, and Chaeronea, risks giving the impression that Athenian hoplites were unsuccessful generally. But this is not a true view. Of the 23 documented actions they were involved in until 322, 6 were defeats, 5 undetermined, and 12 were victories. 8 of these victories, moreover, took place well past the middle of the century, and consequently after the introduction of the year-class colloque system, just as 4 out of 6 defeats and 4 out of 5 undetermined took place before it. Evidently, the more broadly based year-class system did not necessarily entail a decrease in the quality of the armed forces. And while mercenaries were doubtlessly increasingly employed as a necessary supplement, especially on campaigns that were far from Athens or of long duration, the citizens remained the core of the armed forces, and perhaps nowhere more assiduously and conspicuously so than with the hoplite arm. This is clearly brought out by Kephisodotos' protest in the assembly in 369 at the suggestion of a division of coalition command, and I quote, "If the Spartans become your allies, they will obviously send Spartan trireme captains and maybe Spartan epibatai, but the sailors will obviously be helots or mercenaries. These then are the sort of men you will be commanding. But when the Spartans give notice about a campaign on land, you will just as obviously send your hoplites and cavalry. In this way, they will be exercising leadership over you yourselves. You, on the other hand, will be exercising leadership over their slaves and men of very little worth." Unquote. Now, whether or not this speech was in fact delivered exactly like this, for Xenophon's point to be made, he must have been able to count on his contemporary readers accepting the tacit assumption of the premise, namely that by default, Athenian hoplites were Athenian citizens. And that distinction was evidently perceived to be important in military contexts. The sentiment was certainly echoed by the Olynthians in 348, who, despite receiving no fewer than 6,000 mercenary Peltasts and 56 triremes in military aid from Athens, still implored the Athenians to take the field themselves. Now, obviously, this may speak to the quality of these particular mercenaries, or it may speak to the quality of mercenaries in general, or to a high opinion of Athenian citizen hoplites. Whatever the case, the fact remains that the one thing the Olynthians really wished for when the chips were down was an army of Athenian citizens. Thank you.
There is no ancient Greek army that has not been treated in writing by our next speaker. The army of Pyrrhus of Epirus, the army of Philip II of Macedonia, the Spartan army, and so on and so forth. And the same goes for military branches. So it is a pleasure to introduce Professor Nicholas Sekunda. Please, go ahead.
It gives me great pleasure to participate in this conference, organised in great part thanks to the financial support of the Australian Research Council. During the years 1988 to 1989, I was based in the Australian National University, Canberra, working on a project dealing with ancient warfare under the aegis of anyway. The material that I will be dealing with in this presentation, I largely wrote up at the time, but my research on military service and the Athenian poor was cut short by my premature departure for Oxford, where I was employed as deputy editor on the Lexicon of Greek Personal Names. The volume emerging out of this conference will enable me to pay something back to the favours I have received in the past from the Australian Research Council. Entering into the 4th century, the major Athenian contribution to the Corinthian War was their maintenance of a force of mercenary Peltasts in Corinth, thanks to Persian financial support established by Conon and commanded by Iphicrates and then by Chabrias. Although some of them may have been Athenian citizens, they are definitely a mercenary force, and so we cannot speak of them as being Athenian Peltasts. In 388, Chabrias had sailed to help Evagrius of Egypt with a force of 800 Peltasts aboard 10 triremes, to which force he also added more ships and a body of hoplites obtained from Athens. We are left to conclude that the Peltasts are probably not supplied by the Athenians, but are mercenaries. It is uncertain. In this way, on his way to Cyprus, Chabrias landed at Aegina, upon which Gorgopas, the Lacedaemonian admiral, marched against him with his epibartai and all freemen from his crews, with whatever weapons they could obtain. Chabrias routed this force, inflicting heavy losses, which serves as a useful example of how unusual it was for sailors pressed into land service to put up an effective fight. The first indication that we might be dealing with a force of Athenian citizen Peltasts comes in 379. In the winter of 379, the tranquility which had reigned since the king's peace suddenly ended when a group of Theban conspirators operating out of Athens liberated their city and rid it of its Lacedaemonian garrison. The Lacedaemonians sent out an army under Cleombrotus to bring the Thebans into submission, and Cleombrotus set off from Lycodemon that same winter. The approach of Cleombrotus caused a considerable stir in the city, for although the king was not marching against Athens, his march would bring him to the borders of the country, and the Athenians had given the Theban conspirators considerable support. The Athenians, we are told, dispatched Chabrias to guard the road which led through Eleutherae with the Peltasts of the Athenians. Cleombrotus, therefore, not wishing to clash with Chabrias, climbed Mount Kithaeron by another road leading to Plataea. At the summit of the pass, the Lacedaemonian Peltasts, who were in the vanguard, came across a picket of 150 Thebans who had all been released from prison during the liberation of the city. The Peltasts killed them all, but for a few who managed to escape. The army then descended into Boeotia, and after establishing Sphodrias at Thespiae with a garrison, withdrew to the Peloponnese via the road through Cruces. Park thought that the Peltasts of the Athenians under Chabrias must have been, at least in part, composed of Athenian citizens, though he did admit the possibility of some of the Peltasts could have been mercenaries brought back from Egypt by him, but unless he had just arrived from thence in the nick of time, the majority would have scattered at the termination of their service. In fact, the Athenians had only just been persuaded to recall Chabrias from service in Egypt due to the pressure exerted on them by Artaxerxes II. Furthermore, there is no reason to believe that the mercenaries Chabrias commanded in Egypt who would have been hoplites in the main anyway, were Athenians. Consequently, there would have been no reason to leave Egyptian employment, even if they had decided to do so, there is no reason why they should choose to remove themselves to Athens, which was not recruiting mercenaries at the time. Best argued that the Peltasts were Achaemenid allies of the Athenians, but this is even less likely. The crisis had blown up with unexpected rapidity, and it would have been impossible for any allied contingent to have got to Athens from Achaemenid in time to have participated in the events of that winter. Furthermore, Athens was at peace at the time, and so there is no reason why she should have any bodies of mercenaries currently in her employ. From considerations such as these, Park concludes that it is best to take Xenophon's statement perfectly literally and understand that Chabrias was leading a force of volunteer Athenian Peltasts. Most other commentators follow him in seeing the Peltasts as Athenian. In fact, there would have been conscripted. In 376, Cleombrotus again marched to Cathaeron, sending his Peltasts on ahead to occupy the heights above the road. Xenophon tells us that some of the Thebans and Athenians hid near the summit, ambushed the Peltasts, pursued them and killed about 40, upon which Cleombrotus turned back. Given that these operations took place in mountainous terrain around Cathaeron, it is reasonable to suppose that the Theban and Athenian forces were Peltasts like their enemies. The name of the Athenian commander is unfortunately not given. Presumably, this event is a further example of Athenian citizens being mobilized into service as Peltasts. Following the Theban victory over the Lacedaemonians at Leuctra in 371, the Athenians, wary of the rising power of Thebes, switched their sympathies to the Lacedaemonians. When the Thebans under Epaminondas invaded the Peloponnese in 370, the Athenians were persuaded to vote to send a force into the Peloponnese, Pandeme, under Iphicrates as general, to help the Lacedaemonians. Diodorus, after telling us that the Athenians voted to help the Lacedaemonians, Pandeme, tells us that they immediately appointed Iphicrates as general and dispatched him with 12,000 young men on the same day. Diodorus' use of the term neoi to describe these Athenian troops should not be misunderstood. In this context, it means those of military age, that is between 20 and 50, who were normally called upon to serve outside the borders of the country, as opposed to the oldest and youngest men, aged 50 to 60 and 18 to 20. The figure 12,000 troops sent out in 370, even allowing for the fact that the expedition was made Pandeme, is astonishingly large when compared with the 6,000 hoplites and 6,000 cavalry which Athens regularly put in the field, for example during the Corinthian campaign of 394, which, as Lysias specifically states, was undertaken by a general levy of the citizens, Panstration ton politon, and likewise in the Mantinean campaign of 362. Noticing this peculiarity, Gom has concluded that Diodorus is not a good authority, but the huge disparity between the two totals is surely to be explained by the fact that the expedition in 370 was made Panstration, and so comprises troops equipped as Peltasts, raised from the Astoi, as well as hoplites and cavalry. This conjecture is confirmed by Pausanias, who mentions that Iphicrates attacked the Thebans when they marched out of the Peloponnese with a force of Peltasts and other Athenians. These Peltasts are clearly Athenian and are the same troops mentioned in the fighting in 378 379 to 8 and 376. Although it would be dangerous to compute their number too precisely by subtracting the 6,000 hoplites and the 600 cavalry from the 12,000, which would give us a number of some 5,400 Peltasts. There are numerous other indications in the sources that the Athenian state was able to mobilize its citizens into service later in the 4th century. Some of which were alluded to by Professor Gabrielson before. The Philippe sending his sailors from the fleet out and hiring them out as workers. But we don't know whether these are Athenians. But I restricted myself to discussing the three references to specifically Athenian Peltasts. So now let us go back in time to contrast this situation with the 5th century BC. During the Peloponnesian War, the Athenians intermittently made use of Thracian mercenary Peltasts. However, during the summer of 424, Athenian forces were stretched to the utmost in a wide-ranging campaigns throughout Greece. One of these operations culminated in the surrender of the Lacedaemonian garrison on the island of Sphacteria. For his assault on the island, Demosthenes used crews from some 70 ships, all except the Thalametae, each armed in his own way. We can assume that all these troops would have been Nautae Astoi, that is, Athenian citizens and metics, given that the Thalametae were the lowest crew in status. In fact, the fact that Demosthenes has seen fit to arch this huge throng can also be taken as that they were Athenians, or at least metics. To this force, Demosthenes added 800 archers, 800 Peltasts recruited from Ainos, and men on duty from Pylos. We are also told that the troops were divided into companies of about 200 men each, and that the assault group as a whole used arrows, javelins, stones, and slings. Assuming that the arrows and javelins came from the archers and Peltasts respectively, the sailors would have been armed with stones and slings. It seems then that little thought had been given to the use of these oarsmen as psiloi beforehand, with no reserve of weaponry was at hand with which they might have been armed. Following their victory, the Athenians returned home. Later that same year, the Athenians carried out a full-scale levy, pandemia, of Athenians themselves, of the metics, and also from such foreigners, xenoi, who were present in the city, which was sent into Boeotia. A passage in Thucydides 494:1, dealing with the ensuing battle of Delion, is most revealing. There were no regularly armed psiloi present, nor did there happen to be any in the city, and those who joined in, though they were many times greater than their enemy, had mostly come unarmed, because there had been a levy panstratia of xenoi as well of astoi, and thus as soon as they made a start for home, they were not present but for a few. And incidentally, it shows that there was a difference of pandeme and panstratio, because the panstratia levy included xenoi. One notes that that foreigners, xenoi, were recruited in the general levy, contrasted with astor. It has been suggested that one should understand xenoi to mean allies rather than foreigners in this passage, but I mentioned that for the sake of completeness. By comparing this passage with 491, therefore, we are able to conclude that the term astoi is used both of Athenians themselves and the Metics. Boromir Jordan has demonstrated that when the term astos is used epigraphically in Athenian military catalogues, it is used of both Metics and Thetes, and is used in contrast with the term Polites, which would have been restricted to Athenian citizens of the first three census groups who possessed full political as well as civic rights. Thucydides seems to be using the term astos with the same restricted technical meaning in this passage. Commenting on this passage, Griffith, who believes that as a generalization, it can be said that during the earlier war, Athens had no regular force of citizens serving ordinarily as psiloi by land, suggested that these troops were not a properly organized body, but consisted of all the citizens, not of the hoplite class, who were prepared, even without proper equipment, to raid a border state. In its nature, such a force could never take part in regular expeditions. There is consequently no evidence that those below hoplite sentence were organised for any political purpose. Well, I would take issue with the fact that there was a come as you are party. They were conscripted. Whilst not wishing to take Park's principal point that the psiloi were not regularly armed or organised, the words of Thucydides leave the impression that these psiloi did not consist of simply those astoi and xenoi who were prepared to take part in the expedition, but rather that the declaration of an expedition, panstration or pandemei, had compelled them to take part, willingly or otherwise. The fact that they were able to drift back home early, as soon as the expedition started to return, presumably on account of the lack of discipline due to an absence of organisation, does not, I think, argue against the use of conscription in this case. Again, the principal role of the psiloi seems to have been to ravage the horror of the enemy, although Gom's suggestion that on this specific occasion they had been hastily collected for a few days' urgent fortification work. For this, they did not need to be armed, and it seems that, on account of the extent of the panstration involving xenoi as well as astoi, there were not enough weapons to be had in the city to arm them. Therefore, on this campaign, the psiloi were little more than a mob of extremely limited value and hardly subject to any form of military discipline, hence their absence from the battle. However, some 15 years later, in 409, the Athenians resolved that Thrasyllus might call up 1,000 hoplites, 100 cavalry, and 50 triremes. Thrasyllus took the ships which had been voted to him and equipped 5,000 of his oarsmen so that he might employ them as Peltasts, 100 per ship. He sailed for Samos and attacked Pygala, laying waste to the Hora and attacking the walls. A force from Miletus, consisting of hoplites, as their shields are later used to construct a trophy, came to the aid of the Pygalans, and finding the Athenian psiloi, scattered and pursued them. Thereupon the Peltasts and 2 lohoi of hoplites came to the aid of their psiloi and killed all but a few of the men of Miletus. A later section of the same passage mentions that the Athenians' forces consisted of hoplites, cavalry, peltasts, epibartai, and all the rest. This passage is very informative. It is interesting that Xenophon distinguishes between the epibartai who were normally hoplites, but sometimes archers or javelin men, and the hoplites, 20 per trireme, voted for the expedition. It is just possible then that the epibartai might have been among the psiloi of the Athenians, but it seems more probable that this body mentioned are simple oarsmen and are to be identified with the others of 127. Given the unlikelihood that non-Athenian hired rowers would be armed to fight on land, we seem to be dealing with an expedition composed entirely of Athenians, including the psiloi of the Athenians. Thus, we would seem to be dealing with a further example of naval conscription of Athenian citizens, as Xenophon implies when he tells us that the Athenians decreed that Thrasyllus might call up the crews of 50 triremes. In the end, the expedition failed and the Peltasts were heavily defeated at Ephesus. The generalship of Thrasyllus seems to be the main contributive factor towards this, however, for he divided his forces and landed the cavalry, Peltasts, epibartai, and psiloi on marshy ground not suitable for skirmishing tactics. What is of cardinal importance is that some 5,000 of the oarsmen, whether entirely citizens or portmatic, had been trained to fight as Peltasts. The contrast with the situation in 424 BC could not be more evident. Something had happened in Athens to the way military training was delivered. I suggest that this change was brought about by the introduction of peltastic training into the ephebic training program. The ephebic training. The Berlin Papyrus, containing an Aristotelian work dealing with the Athenian constitution, was first published in 1880. This document contained a reasonable detailed account of the Athenian alphabet 42-5 in its current form. It was established that the ephebic system described was the one in operation after a reform of the system had been carried out in 335 by one Epicrates. The scholars were led to ask whether there had indeed been any formal system of ephebic training prior to 335. Wilemovitz, followed by Briand and Brennan, suggested that the Athenian alphabet was a new creation of 335 and that no similar system existed prior to that date. This is the current orthodoxy. I am a heretic. According to the text of the Athenaeum Politeia at 42:4, during the second year of ephebic service, they patrol the countryside and spend their times in guard posts. I have briefly gathered together the evidence for the existence of the Athenian alphabet prior to 335 elsewhere, but I shall merely remark here that the words of the Athenaeum Politeia are very close indeed to the words of Xenophon in the Poroi 452, written around 355 to 4 BC, when he refers to those assigned to garrison duty in the garrisons and those serving as peltasts patrolling the countryside. In this passage, Xenophon is advocating the introduction of maintenance payments, trophy, for those who are assigned to carry out these tasks, in other words, the Thebes. This was precisely what took place approximately 20 years afterwards with the reforms of Epicrates. It is of great interest that in this passage, Xenophon uses the verbs peltadzine and peripoline in conjunction, suggesting that the troops called peropoli were equipped as peltasts. If taken together, both passages suggest that in their second year of training, the ephebes spent their time either patrolling the countryside or serving as hoplites in the forts of Attica. The first reference to the peripoloi in Athenian service comes again from the military operations which were carried out in 424. We hear that the city of Megara was under great stress, it being raided by the Athenian army Panstration twice a year, which resulted in internal divisions in the city. The leaders of the popular party contacted two of the Athenian generals, Hippocrates and Demosthenes, fresh from his successors at Sphacteria, promising to hand the city over to them. The Athenians sailed under cover of night to Minoa, the island which lies off Megara, taking 600 hoplites under the command of Hippocrates, and took cover in a ditch not far from the town, where the bricks had been prepared for the walls. Meanwhile, the Plataean Psiloi and the other peripoloi, who were with Demosthenes, the other general, hid themselves in ambush in the Anialian, which is not less far away. The operation eventually resulted in the Athenian occupation of the Megarian town of Nisaea. Given the small number of hoplites that were involved in the operation, it is unlikely that the two units of peripoloi involved in the campaign were very numerous. The Plataean Psiloi are obviously exiles and would have numbered less than 1,000 men, the strength of the Plataeans deployed at the Battle of Marathon. I imagine that the other peripoloi would have been of similar size. It is probable that the other peripoloi are non-Athenians too. Phrynichus was one of those responsible for the establishment of the oligarchic government of the 400 in 411. The evidence surrounding his assassination later this year is complicated in the extreme, and I do not propose to review it, the evidence now, but it is clear, however, that the plot was hatched up among the peripoloi, and among those possibly involved in the plot was an Argive, an Aetolian from Calydon, and a Megarian. So the probability is that foreigners were most probably political exiles, continued to serve in the Athenian peripoloi in 411, hence their opposition to the undermining of the democratic government of Athens. I suggest that the other peripoloi mentioned in the campaign to help the popular government of Megara in 424, like the Plataean peripoloi or Xenoi. Although the peripoloi continued to number foreigners amongst its ranks, the operations carried out in 424 BC demonstrated the usefulness of the peripoloi as well as the lack of Athenian citizens trained to operate in this manner. It is possible that ephebic training as peripoloi Peltasts began shortly after that date. By the time of the expedition of Thrasyllus in 409, some 15 ephebic age classes would have been passed through the ranks of the peripoloi if the ephebes were trained to patrol the Hora as Peltasts in their second year of service after 424. It is from the oarsmen manning the 50 triremes that Thrasyllus equipped the 5,000 so that he might employ them as Peltasts, leaving aside any calculations based on demographic life tables and discounting all losses suffered in the Peloponnesian War since 424, particularly in Sicily, which would have further distorted the statistical pattern. This leaves us with a minimum figure of 333 and a third ephebes per year, each year class. In the years of financial restraint following the defeat of Athens in the Peloponnesian War, it is highly doubtful whether the maintenance trophy could be found to maintain a corps of peripoloi composed of foreign exiles, and the responsibility of defending the Attic Hora would have fallen exclusively on the ephebes carrying out their duties in the second year of their ephebate and their officers. And so we come finally to the ephebate of Aeschines, which again proves the existence and functioning of the Athenian alphabet before 335. Aeschines includes on his speech on the embassy the following details concerning his military training and service. As soon as I passed out of boyhood, I became a Pyropelos of the Hora for 2 years, and I shall call my son Epheboi and our officers as witnesses. It was necessary for Brennan, who followed Wilamowitz in denying the existence of an ephebic system before 335, to show that this passage did not refer to ephebic service. She therefore maintained that Aeschines had served in the Peripoloi as a mercenary on account of his poverty, and that the Synephedoi he calls as witnesses are simply men of the same age. If this were the case, it would be the sole preserved example of the term synephobos being used in a non-specific sense. In fact, Peltasts has demonstrated that the position of Brennan was not tenable. Elsewhere, in his speech against Timarchus, delivered in 345, Aeschines gives the date of his birth as being around 390. Aeschines uses in this speech against Timarchus in conjunction the terms helikiotes, meaning a person of the same age, and sunephobos, meaning a fellow Ephebe of Misgolas. Therefore, it is hardly likely that the use of the term sunephobos in 167 is non-specific. Furthermore, had Aeschines been forced to serve as a mercenary on account of his poverty, Demosthenes would surely not have lost the opportunity to make use of this fact in some disparaging remark.
Thank you very much.